The shock on Carl Berger's face was unmistakable as he stared across endless rows of corn stretching to the horizon. Just months earlier, he had been a Wehrmacht soldier fighting in North Africa. Now, in the autumn of 1943, he stood in the heartland of America, Iowa, thousands of miles from the European battlefront, tasked with harvesting corn for the very nation he had been trained to despise. "I never imagined America would look like this," he later wrote in a letter home. "We were told American cities were crumbling, but here, everything is abundance." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The tale of German prisoners of war harvesting corn in Iowa represents one of the most unexpected cultural exchanges of World War II, a moment when enemies became reluctant neighbors and stereotypes crumbled in the face of daily interaction. Between 1943 and 1946, nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war were transported across the Atlantic to be housed in over 500 camps throughout the United States. Of these, approximately 10,000 found themselves in Iowa, where they would play a crucial role in saving the state's agricultural production during a time of severe labor shortage. The American heartland, with its vast farmlands and sparse population, was experiencing an acute manpower crisis by 1943. As millions of young American men were deployed overseas and factories absorbed civilian workers for the war effort, the nation's breadbasket faced a dire threat. Crops might rot in the fields with no one to harvest them. The solution to this crisis would come from an unexpected source: captured German soldiers. The story begins in the scorching deserts of North Africa, where the tide of war was turning against Nazi Germany. In May 1943, the Allies achieved a decisive victory in Tunisia, capturing over 275,000 Axis troops, predominantly Germans. Among them was Corporal Werner Hamann, a 24-year-old from Hamburg, who would later describe the moment of his capture. "We had no ammunition, no water, and no hope. When the Americans appeared over the ridge, there was relief mixed with the shame." Military officials faced an immediate dilemma: what to do with this massive number of prisoners? Holding them in the combat theater was impractical. Britain, already strained by rationing and bombing, couldn't accommodate them all. The solution emerged from necessity: transport them to America, where vast spaces and abundant resources could secure them far from the European theater. The decision to bring enemy soldiers to American soil was not taken lightly. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided strict guidelines on the treatment of prisoners of war, stipulating they be housed in similar conditions to the capturing army's own troops, provided appropriate work, and paid for their labor. For the first time since the Civil War, America would house a significant number of enemy prisoners within its borders. The logistics of this prisoner transport were staggering. Converted troop ships, which had delivered American soldiers to the front lines, now returned with holds full of German prisoners. The journey was fraught with danger. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, and now the ships carried men who, just days earlier, had been enemy combatants. Otto Günther, who would eventually be sent to Iowa, described the crossing. "We were packed below decks, many of us still in desert uniforms. The Americans gave us new clothes and treated our wounds. It was confusing. These men were our enemies, yet they shared their rations and even cigarettes. This was not what our officers had told us to expect." As ships docked in ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk, elaborate security measures were implemented. Prisoners disembarked under heavy guard and were immediately loaded onto trains with blacked-out windows. Many Germans had no idea where they were being taken or what fate awaited them. The trains rolled westward, through cities and towns, often in the dead of night to avoid public attention. For Carl Berger and thousands of other German POWs, the first glimpse of the American interior came through small gaps in the train car coverings. We passed endless forests. Then suddenly, there were fields that seemed to have no end, he recounted years later. Some men became more afraid. If we tried to escape, where would we go in this vastness? The decision to establish POW camps in agricultural regions was strategic. The War Department recognized an opportunity to address two problems simultaneously: securely housing prisoners while alleviating the critical farm labor shortage. Camp Algona in northern Iowa, established in June 1943, became one of the first major POW installations in the Midwest. Designed to hold up to 3,000 prisoners with approximately 20 smaller branch camps scattered throughout the state. The site selection for Camp Algona followed careful criteria. It needed to be close enough to farms and food processing plants to make prisoner labor practical, yet remote enough to minimize escape opportunities and contact with civilians. The camp was constructed on 287 acres of farmland with remarkable speed. Within weeks, barracks, guard towers, mess halls, and administrative buildings transformed Iowa farmland into a secure military installation. Major Arthur Lobdell, appointed as Camp Algona's commander, established a philosophy that would shape the entire operation. These men are soldiers who were doing their duty as they saw it, just as our own boys are doing. The war is not fought between individuals who hate each other, it is fought between nations. This perspective would prove crucial in the success of the Iowa POW program. Lobdell's humanistic approach, while never compromising security, created an environment that minimized conflict and eventually fostered unexpected understanding between captors and captives. When the first German prisoners arrived at Camp Algona in July 1943, many experienced profound culture shock. Most had been told that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and living in poverty. Instead, they found themselves in a country of apparent abundance, even during wartime. Their American guards seemed well-fed, well-equipped, and surprisingly casual in their military bearing compared to the rigid German hierarchy. Hans Miller, a 26-year-old artillery officer, wrote, "The Americans appear undisciplined to German eyes. Officers and enlisted men speak casually to each other. But there is efficiency beneath this informality that is unmistakable. Perhaps there is something to learn here." The composition of the prisoner population presented immediate challenges. Among the captured Germans were dedicated Nazis, anti-Nazi Germans, professional soldiers with no strong political convictions, and even some who had been forcibly conscripted from occupied territories and barely identified as German. The American authorities made early efforts to separate the hardcore Nazi elements from the rest, housing them in separate compounds and eventually transferring many to more secure facilities. Camp life quickly developed its own routine. Prisoners were housed in barracks similar to those used by American troops, with 8 men typically sharing a room. They received the same rations as American soldiers, which for many Germans seemed luxurious compared to what they had experienced in the final months before capture in resource-starved North Africa. The daily schedule included roll calls, meals, work assignments, and free time for educational and recreational activities. Despite being enemies, a mutual respect began to develop between guards and prisoners. Lieutenant James Carson, who served as a guard at Camp Algona, later reflected, "We came to see them as men like ourselves. Many had been teachers, farmers, students before the war. They hadn't created the Nazi regime. Most had simply been drafted like our own boys." By late summer 1943, the critical moment in this story arrived. Iowa's farmers faced a desperate situation. With corn reaching maturity and the harvest season approaching, there simply weren't enough hands to bring in the crop. The War Food Administration estimated that Iowa alone needed at least 20,000 additional workers to harvest the essential corn crop, a key component of both human and livestock food supplies. After complex negotiations between the War Department, the Department of Agriculture, and Iowa state officials, an unprecedented decision was made. German prisoners of war would be deployed to save America's heartland harvest. This required delicate handling. Americans were still receiving news of battlefield deaths, and the prospect of enemy soldiers working in their communities raised understandable concerns. Iowa Governor Burke B. Hickenlooper addressed these concerns directly. "I understand the hesitation some may feel, but I must emphasize two critical facts. First, these men will work under constant guard. Second, without this labor, we face a genuine threat to our food supply, which is as crucial to victory as bullets and bombs." The first deployment of German POWs to Iowa farms began in September 1943. Small groups of prisoners, typically 10 to 50 men, were transported daily from Camp Algona and its satellite camps to farms throughout northern Iowa. Under the Geneva Convention, officers could not be compelled to work, but many volunteered, preferring activity to the monotony of camp life. For most Iowa farmers, the arrival of German POWs in their fields marked their first direct contact with the enemy. Elmer Johnson, whose family had farmed outside Mason City for 3 generations, recalled his apprehension. "I didn't know what to expect. My son was fighting in Italy against these men's comrades, yet here they were, about to handle my crop, the crop that would determine if my family survived financially that year." The initial encounters were tense, characterized by cautious observation on both sides. Farmers watched closely as the Germans were instructed in the American methods of corn harvesting, physically demanding work that required picking by hand, as mechanical harvesters were still relatively rare. The Germans, for their part, observed the American farmers with equal curiosity. Many prisoners had agricultural backgrounds, having worked on farms in Germany before the war. Their familiarity with agricultural labor proved valuable, though American farming methods and the scale of production often amazed them. Fritz Weber, who had grown up on a small farm in Bavaria, wrote home, "The farms here are like nothing in Germany. One farm might be the size of an entire village's holdings at home, and the soil so rich you can sink your arm into it up to the elbow." What began as awkward necessity soon developed into something more complex. By October 1943, as the harvest intensified, a routine developed. Farmers found that most prisoners were hard-working and efficient. The Germans, despite their status as captives, often took pride in demonstrating their agricultural skills. Within weeks, the initial strangeness began to give way to a working relationship based on mutual dependence. Communication posed an early challenge. Few farmers spoke German, and initially few prisoners spoke English. This language barrier was bridged in creative ways, through hand gestures, improvised sign language, and the universal language of farming. Gradually, as days turned into weeks, both sides began picking up words and phrases from each other. Marvin Schlichting, a teenage farm boy whose father employed POW labor, described the unexpected cultural exchange. "My father knew some German from his grandfather. He taught the prisoners English words for tools and crops, and they taught him German songs. By November, they were sharing cigarettes during breaks, despite the rules against fraternization. The impact on agricultural production was immediate and substantial. Reports from the War Food Administration showed that in counties utilizing POW labor, harvest completion rates were nearly 35% higher than in comparable counties without access to prisoners." Iowa's 1943 corn harvest, initially projected to face catastrophic losses, ended with only minimal crop waste, largely attributed to the influx of prisoner labor. For the prisoners, the farm work offered more than just activity. It provided a sense of normalcy and purpose during their captivity. Many spoke of the psychological benefit of productive work after the chaos and trauma of combat. Hans Berger wrote, "In Africa, we destroyed. Here, we create. We help food grow. There is satisfaction in this, even if it helps our enemy's war effort, perhaps especially because of that paradox." The prisoners received payment for their labor, though not directly. Under Geneva Convention rules, they were paid 80 cents per day, with the money held in camp accounts until their eventual repatriation. This amount, while small by American standards, accumulated into significant sums for many prisoners who worked consistently throughout their captivity. As fall progressed into winter, the nature of agricultural work changed. After the corn harvest concluded, many prisoners were shifted to food processing plants, livestock operations, and preparation work for the following year's planting. Camp Algona established training programs to teach prisoners additional agricultural skills, expanding their usefulness beyond seasonal harvesting. The winter of 1943-44 brought new challenges. The harsh Iowa cold was shocking to many Germans, particularly those who had been captured in the North African desert. The camp administrators scrambled to ensure adequate winter clothing and heating for the barracks. Despite these efforts, the first winter saw increased illness among the prisoners, though serious cases were rare, thanks to the camp's medical facilities. During the winter months, educational programs expanded within the camps. American authorities, recognizing the potential for post-war influence, encouraged classes in English, American history, and democratic principles. These classes were voluntary but popular, with over 60% of prisoners at Camp Algona participating in some form of education by early 1944. Hans Weber, a former school teacher from Munich, became an instructor in the camp's educational program. We teach each other what we know. I teach English and mathematics. Others teach music, art, or trades. The Americans provide books and materials. It is strange. In some ways, I have more freedom to teach here than I did in Germany during the last years before the war, when everything had to follow party doctrine. The educational efforts extended beyond academics. Cultural activities flourished, with prisoners forming orchestras, theater groups, and sports teams. Camp Algona became known for its prisoner orchestra, which performed classical German music, as well as American compositions they were learning. Art programs produced remarkable works, including an elaborate nativity scene carved by German POWs that still exists today as a historical artifact in Algona. By spring 1944, as a new growing season approached, the German POW labor program had become an established part of Iowa's agricultural system. The initial wariness had evolved into a functional relationship that, while never forgetting the reality of the global conflict, nevertheless accommodated a kind of wary cooperation. The experiences of that first harvest season had demonstrated that the program could work on a practical level. Now, as the second year began, both the American authorities and the prisoners themselves had learned valuable lessons about how to navigate this unusual arrangement. The prisoners had become more accustomed to American farming methods, and many had acquired basic English skills. The farmers had learned how to communicate work requirements more effectively and had developed systems for training and supervising prisoner labor. As Allied forces prepared for the D-Day invasion in Europe, the work of German prisoners in Iowa's fields continued, an ironic counterpoint to the brutal combat their comrades still faced. News of the invasion reached the POW camps through approved newspaper and radio reports. The reaction among prisoners varied dramatically. Some became more withdrawn and hostile. Others seemed resigned to Germany's eventual defeat. Captain Ernst Kramer, a Wehrmacht officer held at Camp Algona, described the strange experience. We received news of Allied bombing of our cities, of battles where our friends likely fought and died. Then we went out to the American fields to work under the same sun, as if in another world entirely. The contradiction was sometimes too much to bear. For Iowa's communities, the presence of German prisoners had become an accepted, if still unusual, part of wartime life. Initial fears had largely subsided as the security measures proved effective. Escapes were rare and quickly resolved. Most prisoners recognized the futility of escape in the middle of Iowa, thousands of miles from any potential German territory. The few escape attempts that did occur revealed the impracticality of such efforts. In one notable case from August 1944, 2 prisoners from Camp Algona slipped away during a farm work detail, only to be found 3 days later, hungry and disoriented, asking directions from a local farmer who immediately recognized them as escapees. More significant than the security concerns was the evolving relationship between the prisoners and local communities. Despite official policies discouraging fraternization, Human connections inevitably formed through daily interaction. Farmers who worked alongside the same prisoners for months began to see them as individuals rather than as a faceless enemy. Martha Jensen, who helped run her family farm while her husband served in Europe, described this evolution. At first, I couldn't look at them without thinking of John facing their countrymen with guns. But slowly, I began to see that Franz had a wife's photo he carried everywhere. Carl would ask about my children using his broken English. They were someone's sons, too, caught in the same terrible war. This gradual humanization occurred despite significant barriers. Military authorities maintained strict regulations about prisoner-civilian interaction. Prisoners were forbidden from entering farmers' homes, sharing meals with Americans, or engaging in conversation beyond what was necessary for work. Guards were present during farm labor, though as the program proved successful, the ratio of guards to prisoners was gradually reduced for efficiency. Nevertheless, the reality of daily proximity led to countless small exchanges that regulations couldn't prevent. Farmers slipped extra food to hard-working prisoners. Prisoners carved wooden toys for farmers' children. Brief conversations during water breaks expanded from work instructions to cautious personal exchanges. By late summer 1944, as another harvest season approached, the POW labor program had expanded. Additional branch camps were established across Iowa, bringing prisoners closer to the farms where they worked and reducing transportation needs. The number of prisoners working in Iowa agriculture peaked at approximately 5,000 during the critical harvest months. Their contribution was increasingly vital as the war intensified and military manpower needs further depleted America's agricultural workforce. The Iowa Farm Bureau estimated that German POW labor was responsible for saving approximately 20% of the 1944 corn crop from being lost due to labor shortages. For the prisoners, the second year of captivity brought increased comfort with their surroundings, but also deepening uncertainty about their homeland's fate. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, many received increasingly distressing news from home through the censored mail system. Cities bombed, families displaced, the gradual collapse of the Nazi regime, all formed the distant backdrop to their daily work in peaceful Iowa fields. This psychological burden manifested in various ways. Some prisoners became more withdrawn. Others worked with increased intensity, as if to distract themselves from worries about home. The camp authorities noted increased interest in news reports and maps tracking the Allied advance into Germany. Lieutenant James Peterson, an intelligence officer at Camp Algona, reported, "The mood shifts with news from Europe. After reports of heavy bombing of German cities, we see depression, sometimes hostility. When they receive letters confirming their families are safe, productivity improves immediately. They are soldiers, but they are men first. Their concerns are fundamentally human." The American military authorities, recognizing the psychological impact of Germany's deteriorating position, implemented programs to prepare prisoners for their eventual return to a defeated homeland. Educational offerings expanded to include courses on democratic governance, civic responsibility, and reconstruction skills that might prove valuable in post-war Germany. By early 1945, as Allied victory appeared increasingly certain, a remarkable transformation had occurred in many POW camps. The strict separation between captors and captives had softened into a more complex relationship. While never forgetting the fundamental reality of their situation, many prisoners and Americans had developed a grudging mutual respect. Helmut Schneider, who spent nearly 2 years working on Iowa farms, wrote after the war, "We came as enemies, worked as laborers, and left, many of us, as something closer to understanding, if not friendship. I learned that Americans were not as our propaganda had portrayed them. They learned we were not all monsters." This was perhaps a small victory for humanity amid the great tragedy of the war. As spring arrived in 1945, bringing news of Germany's imminent defeat, both prisoners and their American supervisors faced the uncertain question of what would come next. The farm labor program had proven remarkably successful in agricultural terms, but as the war in Europe reached its climax, the future of these tens of thousands of German soldiers on American soil hung in the balance. What would happen when the fighting stopped? Would they be immediately returned to their shattered homeland, or would they remain in America to continue addressing the labor shortage that still plagued American agriculture? The answer would emerge in the chaotic final days of the European conflict, as the Third Reich collapsed and the full horror of Nazi atrocities was revealed to the world. For the German prisoners in Iowa's cornfields, the end of the war would not mean an immediate return to Germany, but rather the beginning of a new phase in their American experience, one that would further transform their understanding of both their captors and themselves. The news of Germany's surrender in May 1945 reached the cornfields of Iowa during spring planting. For the German prisoners working the land, the moment brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, concern for families back home, and uncertainty about their own futures. When we heard Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered, there was no celebration in the camp, recalled Werner Schmidt. Instead, a heavy silence fell. We were alive, while many of our comrades were not. We had lost the war, but in that moment, it felt like everyone had lost something. The surrender created an immediate practical question. What would happen to the nearly 400,000 German POWs now held on American soil? Many prisoners expected rapid repatriation, but the reality proved far more complicated. Post-war Germany lay in ruins, divided among Allied occupation zones with severe food shortages and housing crises. American military authorities determined that immediate mass repatriation would overwhelm the struggling occupation administration and potentially create dangerous instability. In Iowa, where the 1945 growing season was already underway with significant POW labor involvement, agricultural officials urgently appealed to the War Department to maintain the prisoner workforce through the harvest. With millions of American servicemen still deployed overseas and the Pacific War continuing against Japan, the labor shortage remained acute. After extensive deliberation, American authorities implemented a phased repatriation plan. Prisoners would be returned to Europe gradually, with priority given to those with specialized skills needed for reconstruction, anti-Nazi prisoners who might help establish democratic institutions, and those with urgent family situations. For most, however, repatriation would wait until 1946 or even 1947, meaning another harvest season or more in America. This decision transformed the POW labor program. The prisoners were no longer enemy combatants in an active war, but rather displaced foreigners awaiting return to a defeated homeland. Their legal status remained that of prisoners of war, but their psychological status had fundamentally changed. At Camp Algona and its satellite camps, the announcement that most prisoners would remain in America for at least another year met with mixed reactions. Some prisoners protested, feeling they were being held unlawfully now that the conflict had ended. Others, particularly those who had received news of destroyed homes or displaced families, quietly accepted the extension, recognizing that immediate return offered little benefit and continued work in America at least provided purpose and security. Karl Heinz, who had spent nearly 2 years working on farms near Mason City, wrote, "Many of the men are angry that we cannot go home immediately. I understand this feeling, but I also received a letter last week that our apartment building in Hamburg no longer exists. My wife and daughter are living with 12 others in a basement. What would I do there now, with no home and no work? At least here, I have regular meals and can save my pay for when I return." The American military administration, recognizing the changed circumstances, implemented several significant modifications to the POW program after Germany's surrender. Security measures were gradually relaxed, with reduced guard presence during work assignments and greater freedom of movement within camp boundaries. Educational programs expanded dramatically, with increased emphasis on democratic values and practical skills for post-war reconstruction. Perhaps most significantly, the military permitted increased interaction between prisoners and civilians, acknowledging that the fraternization restrictions of wartime had become increasingly impractical and counterproductive. Farmers were now allowed to provide meals to prisoner workers, and conversations beyond work instructions were no longer discouraged. This relaxation of restrictions accelerated the cultural exchange that had been occurring despite previous limitations. German prisoners increasingly dined with farm families, practiced their English, and learned about American life directly from citizens rather than through official channels. The Christensen family, who farmed outside Clarion, Iowa, developed a particularly meaningful relationship with the prisoners who worked their land. After restrictions eased, Martha Christensen recalled, "We had 5 German boys working here regularly. After the surrender, they started taking meals with us. 2 of them played piano, and my daughter played violin. By midsummer, they were having musical evenings twice a week. My husband said, if someone had told me in 1943 that I'd have Germans making music in my living room, I'd have called them crazy." For many Iowa families, the gradual humanization of the enemy posed complicated emotional questions, particularly for those with sons still fighting in the Pacific or who had lost loved ones in Europe. Some communities maintained strict separation despite the relaxed regulations, while others embraced the opportunity for reconciliation on a personal level. Pastor Robert Anderson of the First Lutheran Church in Algona became an advocate for this reconciliation approach. Christ teaches us to love our enemies. This command is easy to ignore during war, but now we have an opportunity to demonstrate its power. These men did not create Nazism. Many were its victims too. In showing kindness now, we plant seeds for a more peaceful future. The pastor's view gained traction as summer progressed into fall. His congregation began inviting groups of prisoners to Sunday services, with a German-language portion included. Other churches followed suit, and by harvest time, it had become common to see German prisoners attending Iowa churches under minimal guard supervision. This religious connection proved particularly meaningful for many prisoners. Wilhelm Müller, who had been a theology student before being drafted, wrote, "In the church, we are not enemies or even foreigners, but fellow Christians. When we sing hymns that exist in both German and English traditions, I feel a recognition that our common humanity transcends the temporary divisions of nations and politics." The 1945 harvest season marked the high point of the POW labor program in Iowa. With security concerns diminished after Germany's surrender, the efficiency of the operation improved dramatically. Prisoners were now often transported to farms in the morning and picked up in the evening with only periodic guard checks rather than constant supervision. Many worked in the same locations consistently, developing familiarity with specific farms and forming ongoing relationships with the families. Agricultural production statistics reflected this increased efficiency. Iowa's 1945 corn harvest exceeded projections by nearly 15%, with counties utilizing POW labor showing the strongest results. The Iowa Farm Bureau formally recognized the prisoner labor program's contribution as essential to maintaining food production during this critical period of transition from war to peace. As the harvest concluded and winter approached, the POW camp system began its gradual dismantling. The War Department initiated the first major wave of repatriations, with approximately 25% of prisoners returned to Europe before the end of 1945. Priority was given to those with specialized reconstruction skills, anti-Nazi credentials, and compelling family circumstances. For those who remained, the winter of 1945-46 brought intensified educational efforts. Camp Algona expanded its course offerings to include practical trades, democratic political theory, and American cultural studies. The camp's newsletter, previously heavily censored, now featured prisoner-written articles about American customs, farming techniques, and even recipes they had encountered during their captivity. Fritz Weber, who had initially been captured in North Africa in 1943, reflected on this transformation. When I arrived, I could barely speak 5 words of English, and I believed everything our propaganda had told us about the barbaric Americans. Now I read American newspapers, discuss politics with the guards, and have learned enough about farming methods here to consider agricultural college when I return home. The man who was captured is not the same man who will be repatriated. The educational emphasis reflected a growing American awareness that these prisoners would influence post-war Germany's reconstruction and political development. Military intelligence officers regularly evaluated prisoners, identifying those with democratic leanings who might serve as community leaders after repatriation. These individuals received additional training and responsibility within the camp system. By spring 1946, as another growing season approached, the POW population had diminished significantly through ongoing repatriation. Camp Algona's prisoner count had decreased from its peak of 3,000 to fewer than 1 to 200. Many of the satellite camps throughout Iowa had closed entirely, with remaining prisoners consolidated at the main facility. For Iowa's farmers, who had come to rely on this labor source, the reduction created renewed concerns about the upcoming planting and harvest seasons. In response, the War Department prioritized repatriation of prisoners from industrial assignments while temporarily retaining agricultural workers through the 1946 harvest. This decision meant that many of the prisoners who had worked longest on Iowa farms and who had formed the deepest connections with local communities would be among the last to return to Germany. Some had now spent 3 years in Iowa, longer than many had served in the German military before capture. The extension permitted a final agricultural cycle with POW labor involvement, though at reduced capacity. The 1946 planting season proceeded with approximately 3,000 prisoners working throughout Iowa, down from the peak of 5,000 during previous harvests. Farmers increasingly supplemented this diminishing workforce with returning American veterans and an influx of mechanical equipment that had become more available as wartime production restrictions eased. As summer progressed, the repatriation pace accelerated. By August 1946, only about 1,000 German prisoners remained in Iowa, primarily concentrated at Camp Algona. Military authorities announced that all Iowa POW facilities would close by year's end, with all remaining prisoners repatriated to Europe. This announcement brought a wave of reflection and, in many cases, farewells between prisoners and the Iowa communities where they had spent significant portions of their young lives. Farmers who had employed the same prisoners for multiple seasons often hosted informal goodbye gatherings. Churches held special services for departing prisoners. Some town newspapers published farewell letters from prisoners expressing gratitude for the humane treatment they had received. Johann Miller, who had worked on the Anderson farm for nearly 3 years, wrote in the Algona Upper Des Moines newspaper, "I came to Iowa as a soldier of Germany, but I leave as a friend of America. What I have learned here about democracy, hard work, and kindness, I will take back to help build a new Germany. Thank you for treating us not as enemies, but as fellow human beings caught in history's storm." Such sentiments were common among prisoners who had experienced the gradual transformation from wartime captivity to something closer to a cultural exchange program. Many expressed intention to maintain contact with the Americans they had met, particularly the farm families with whom they had worked closely. For their part, many Iowa farmers and townspeople had undergone their own transformation in perspective. Martha Johnson, whose husband and son had both served in Europe, expressed this evolution. In 1943, I couldn't bear to look at them. By 1946, I was teaching 2 of them to bake apple pie the way my grandmother taught me. War makes strangers into enemies. Peace lets us see each other as people again. The final phase of the POW program in Iowa concluded in December 1946, when Camp Algona officially closed. The last group of 30 prisoners who had remained to help dismantle the camp facilities, boarded trains for the East Coast, from where they would ship to Europe. The 287-acre site that had housed thousands of German soldiers returned to its previous agricultural use, with buildings either repurposed or dismantled. As the former prisoners returned to a Germany vastly different from the one they had left, many carried with them not only memories but also practical knowledge and changed perspectives that would influence their roles in rebuilding their nation. Their experiences in America's heartland had exposed them to democratic principles, efficient agricultural methods, and alternative social structures at a formative time in their lives. The impact of this exposure became evident in the subsequent careers and life choices of many former POWs. Hans Weber, who had taught in the camp's educational program, returned to Germany to help establish new educational curricula free from Nazi ideology. Karl Berger, who had worked 3 seasons on Iowa farms, applied his knowledge of American agricultural techniques to help modernize farming in his home region. Wilhelm Müller completed his theology studies and became a pastor known for promoting reconciliation between former enemies. Perhaps most remarkably, dozens of former prisoners eventually returned to the United States as immigrants in the 1950s, with several specifically returning to Iowa, where they had been held as POWs. Having experienced American life as prisoners, they chose to return as citizens, often maintaining connections with the same communities where they had once worked as captives. Ernst Kramer, who had been an officer at Camp Algona, immigrated to Iowa in 1952 and established a successful farm equipment business near Mason City. When interviewed years later about this unusual life trajectory, he explained, "I saw the potential of America during those years as a prisoner. I learned the language, understood the agriculture, and sensed the opportunity here. When Germany was rebuilt enough that I could leave with good conscience, America, specifically Iowa, was my destination. Where else would I go? This place had become familiar, almost like a second home, despite the circumstances of my first arrival. For Iowa's farming communities, the POW labor program left lasting impressions that extended far beyond its economic impact. Families who had worked alongside German prisoners often maintained correspondence with them for years after repatriation. These connections sometimes spanned generations, with children and grandchildren continuing the international friendships that had begun in such unlikely circumstances. The historical significance of this episode extends beyond personal connections. The German POW experience in Iowa represented a unique experiment in enemy detention, one that evolved from security-focused imprisonment toward a more rehabilitative and educational model as the war progressed. Military historians have subsequently analyzed the program as one of the most successful POW operations in modern warfare. The escape rate was remarkably low, less than 0.01%, with minimal violence or disciplinary problems. The economic contribution was substantial, with POW labor credited for preventing significant agricultural losses during critical wartime harvests. Perhaps most significantly, the program demonstrated the potential for humanistic treatment of enemy prisoners to yield positive post-conflict outcomes. Dr. Michael Wagner, who studied the Iowa POW camps extensively, concluded the experience fundamentally challenged the dehumanization that typically occurs between warring nations. These German soldiers, who had been taught to view Americans as enemies, experienced firsthand the contradiction between Nazi propaganda and American reality. Similarly, Iowa's communities, receiving news of battlefield losses, might have treated these prisoners with hostility, but instead increasingly recognized their common humanity. The physical evidence of this history has largely vanished from Iowa's landscape. Camp Algona was dismantled, with only a small museum now marking its location. Most of the branch camps left no permanent structures. The primary artifacts remaining are personal, letters, photographs, and handcrafted items exchanged between prisoners and locals. Among the most poignant of these artifacts is the elaborate nativity scene created by 6 German POWs at Camp Algona in 1945. Featuring over 60 half-life-sized wooden figures, the Nativity was the prisoners' expression of gratitude toward the community. Edward Kaib, the project's lead artist, described it as our gift to the American people who treated us as men, not enemies. The Nativity remains on display in Algona today, a tangible reminder of an unexpected moment of human connection amid global conflict. These physical artifacts, however, represent only a fraction of the program's legacy. The more significant impact lies in the changed perspectives carried back to Germany by thousands of former prisoners. At a time when Germany needed to rebuild not just its infrastructure, but its entire political and social framework, these men returned with first-hand experience of American democracy, agricultural practices, and daily life. Former Camp Algona prisoner Kurt Meyer later became a civic leader in his hometown of Hanover. In a 1965 interview, he reflected, "My time in Iowa shaped my understanding of what post-war Germany could become. I saw a society where farmers owned their land, voted for their leaders, and spoke freely about politics without fear. This vision guided my work in local government, trying to build something similar in my community." The historical timing of the POW program proved particularly significant. These prisoners returned to a Germany at 0 hour, a nation physically devastated, politically transformed, and searching for a new identity. Their American experience provided one potential model during this formative period of modern German development. Dr. Margarete Schaller, a historian specializing in post-war German Reconstruction, notes, "The approximately 372,000 German POWs who returned from America represented a substantial cohort of young men with a unique international perspective during Germany's critical rebuilding phase. Their impact, while difficult to quantify precisely, appears throughout accounts of local reconstruction efforts, particularly in agriculture, education, and civic institutions. The agricultural impact was perhaps most immediate. Former prisoners applied American farming techniques to help address the severe food shortages plaguing post-war Germany. Several former POWs established agricultural training programs based on methods they had learned in Iowa, helping modernize German farming practices during the critical Reconstruction period. Heinrich Schultz, who had worked 2 harvest seasons near Clarion, Iowa, established an agricultural cooperative in his home region of Lower Saxony in 1948. The cooperative explicitly incorporated organizational approaches he had observed on Iowa farms. The Americans had systems for sharing equipment, coordinating planting and harvest schedules, and collectively marketing their crops, he explained years later. These approaches helped us maximize limited resources during those difficult early Reconstruction years. Beyond specific skills, many former prisoners returned with transformed political perspectives. Having experienced American democracy during a pivotal period of their young adult lives, many became advocates for democratic institutions in post-war Germany. Military intelligence records indicate that approximately 30% of prisoners held in the United States were classified as likely to support democratic development upon repatriation, a significantly higher percentage than those held in British or French captivity. For many, the contrast between Nazi indoctrination and their American experience produced lasting perspective shifts. Werner Baum, who spent 32 months in Iowa POW camps, later wrote, "Under Hitler, we were taught that democracy was chaotic and weak. In Iowa, I saw orderly town meetings where farmers debated local issues, vigorously but peacefully. I witnessed elections where power transferred without violence. These experiences contradicted everything our propaganda had claimed. As Cold War divisions hardened and Germany split between East and West, former American-held POWs often became especially strong advocates for alignment with Western democratic systems. Their first-hand exposure to American society provided a counter-narrative to Soviet-sponsored criticism of Western capitalism and democracy. Several former Camp Algona prisoners became active in West German politics during the crucial early years of the Federal Republic. On a more personal level, the Iowa POW experience resulted in hundreds of ongoing international connections that bridged former enemy nations. Many prisoners maintained correspondence with Iowa families for decades. These relationships sometimes facilitated trade connections, educational exchanges, and even immigration assistance as travel between Germany and America normalized in the 1950s. The Johnson family of Kossuth County exchanged letters with former prisoner Walter Schmidt for over 40 years. This correspondence expanded to include children and grandchildren, with several family members visiting between countries. Martha Johnson reflected in 1985, what began with suspicious glances across a cornfield somehow turned into a friendship that has linked our families across an ocean for 2 generations. If someone had predicted this outcome in 1943, I would have thought them insane. For the Iowa communities that hosted prisoners, the experience also left lasting impressions. Many towns that had initially feared the enemy presence came to view the POW program as a point of historical pride, a moment when their community had directly participated in an unusual humanitarian chapter of the war effort. Local historical societies in several Iowa counties have preserved records, photographs, and artifacts from the POW era. Community celebrations occasionally feature recognition of this history, sometimes including reunions with former prisoners or their descendants. The Algona POW Camp Museum, established in 1991, maintains the most comprehensive collection of materials related to this history. Museum Director Leonard Stanley explains, visitors are often surprised to learn that thousands of German soldiers lived and worked in Iowa during World War II. This history challenges our typical understanding of the home front during wartime. It's a story about finding humanity in unexpected places, about enemies becoming neighbors, however temporarily. The educational value of this history has grown over time, offering insights into conflict resolution, cultural understanding, and the malleability of human perspective. Several Iowa schools now include the POW labor program in their local history curriculum, using it to explore how perceived enemies can find common ground through shared work and daily interaction. The story also provides a counterpoint to darker chapters of wartime prisoner treatment throughout history. While acknowledging that the American POW system was not perfect and that experiences varied across camps, the Iowa program demonstrated that adherence to Geneva Convention standards and humane treatment could yield benefits beyond the immediate humanitarian considerations. As POW Werner Lutz wrote after returning to Germany, "We were not treated as heroes in America, but neither were we treated as monsters. We were treated as men who, like the Americans themselves, had been caught in a war not of our individual making. This basic respect made it possible for us to see each other as human beings despite the conflict between our nations." The German POW experience in Iowa offers several enduring lessons that transcend its specific historical moment. It demonstrates how sustained human contact can overcome propaganda-driven dehumanization. It illustrates how shared labor toward common goals can bridge seemingly insurmountable differences. Perhaps most significantly, it shows how even relationships that begin in conflict can evolve toward understanding when basic human dignity is preserved. As global conflicts continue to create new populations of detainees, refugees, and displaced persons, the Iowa POW story serves as a reminder that how we treat those designated as enemies during conflict can significantly influence post-war reconciliation and reconstruction. Treatment that preserves dignity and offers opportunities for meaningful activity and education may yield long-term benefits that extend far beyond the immediate security considerations. The passage of time has not diminished the historical significance of this unusual wartime chapter. If anything, greater historical distance has highlighted its exceptional nature. A moment when enemy soldiers harvested American crops, when Iowa farm families cautiously opened their dinner tables to men whose comrades were fighting their sons overseas, when the rigid boundaries of wartime gradually yielded to recognition of common humanity. As former prisoner Hans Müller wrote in his final letter to the Anderson family of Kossuth County, "When I think of America, I do not think first of your great cities or your military might, though both are impressive. I think instead of your endless fields of corn stretching to the horizon, of the farm table where I first tasted your wife's apple pie, of the Sunday when your community allowed us, prisoners and enemies, to sing Christmas carols in our native German in your church. These moments taught me more about America's true strength than any display of weapons ever could." For thousands of German soldiers, their enduring image of America would not be one of military conquest, but rather of Iowa's fertile fields, where they experienced an unexpected interval of productive peace amid humanity's deadliest conflict. For Iowa's communities, the German POWs remain a complex memory. Men who arrived as enemies, but through shared labor and gradual understanding, departed as something closer to neighbors. This remarkable history reminds us that even in our darkest hours, human connection can transcend the artificial boundaries of nations at war. As one former Camp Algona guard reflected years later, we all learned something there among the cornfields, Germans and Americans alike. We learned that the categories of enemy and friend are more fluid than we had been taught to believe. That lesson seems worth remembering.